There is a civilization so wealthy, so sophisticated, so culturally advanced, that ancient Greek sailors came home and told stories about it the way we tell stories about El Dorado or Atlantis. They spoke of a king who lived for centuries, of rivers that ran with silver, of a city so dazzling it could not possibly be real. And here's the thing, it was real. Tartessos. The name itself sounds like myth, a kingdom at the edge of the known world, sitting on the southwestern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Mediterranean Sea surrenders to the open Atlantic. The Greeks called it the first civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the edge of everything they understood. They traded with it, wrote about it, marveled at it, and then, sometime around 500 BC, it vanished. Not gradually, not through slow decline that historians can trace and document. It simply stopped. The cities went quiet. The culture dissolved. The people scattered into the archaeological record like smoke into wind. But here's what almost no one realizes. We still don't know where it was. After 2,500 years of searching, after satellite imaging, after archaeological digs, after decades of scholarly debate, the heart of Tartessos remains lost. Its capital city, if it had one, has never been found. The location is still, formally, disputed. But that's not even the strangest part. The strangest part is what the Greeks told us about Tartessos, and what they didn't. They gave us the name of a king. They described its harbors. They recorded its wealth in almost embarrassing detail. And yet, every physical trace of this civilization that archaeologists have uncovered tells a story that doesn't quite match the Greek account. It's as if the civilization they described and the one we found in the earth are two different places or two different moments in the same story. By the end of this, you will see the so-called Atlantis of Spain completely differently. Not as a myth, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a warning that was buried so deep it took 2,500 years for anyone to read it. Close your eyes and imagine you are standing at the edge of a river. Not just any river, one that smells of mineral earth and salt air, one that catches the early morning light and throws it back at you in pieces. The year is somewhere around 800 BC. The air is warm. You can hear the sound of hammers. This is Tartessos at its height. The city, or the network of cities, or whatever exactly this place was, sits where three rivers converge near the Atlantic coast of what we now call Andalusia. The geography itself is almost absurdly generous. Fertile floodplains for agriculture, nearby mountains riddled with copper, tin and silver, and a natural harbour that makes it the obvious meeting point between the Mediterranean world and the Atlantic frontier. The wealth here is not theoretical, it is physical. It is in the ground beneath your feet. Meet Hanno. He is a Tartessian merchant, maybe 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and hands that know the weight of silver ingots better than they know anything else. His tunic is Phoenician linen, traded, not bought, because in Tartessos, everything is a negotiation, a relationship, a web of mutual benefit, stretching from here to Carthage, to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. He speaks his own language, a language unlike anything else in the ancient world, not Phoenician, not Celtic, not Proto-Spanish. It is the Tartessian script, and to this day, scholars can read its letters but cannot fully translate its words. Hanno's city is not small. The people around him move with the confidence of those who have never seriously questioned whether their world will still be here tomorrow. Craftsmen work bronze and gold into objects of extraordinary delicacy, torques and diadems and bowls decorated with mythological scenes. Farmers bring grain downriver on flat-bottomed boats. Children play near the waterfront where Phoenician traders have set up their stalls, their dark ships anchored in the harbor like patient guests. Because that's what Tartessos believed about itself in this moment, that it was permanent, that the rivers would always carry silver, that the trade winds would always bring partners from the east, that the mountains would never run out. They built for permanence. They inscribed their names into stone. They developed their own cosmology, their own burial rituals, their own mythology, which has been almost entirely lost to us, like a library burned in a fire we never saw. Hanno watches a Phoenician ship unload silk and colored glass at the dock, and he smiles. He has a meeting this afternoon with a buyer from the Greek colony at Massalia, modern Marseille, who wants 300 pounds of silver ore. The deal is already done in his head. He has no idea that the three things that will end his world are already in motion. For generations, the relationship between Tartessos and the Phoenicians had been the foundation of everything. The Phoenicians came first, sometime around 1100 BC, sailing beyond the Pillars of Hercules, establishing a trading colony at Gadir, the city we now call Cadiz, and Tartessos welcomed them. Of course it did. The Phoenicians brought the glasswork, the purple dye, the luxury goods that made Tartessian elites look like kings of the world. In exchange, Tartessos gave them silver, oceans of it. But somewhere in the 7th century BC, something began to shift. The Phoenician homeland was unraveling. Tyre, the great Phoenician metropolis on the eastern Mediterranean, was under pressure from the Assyrian Empire. Trade routes were being disrupted. Phoenician merchants who had always operated as partners, as guests, began to look at Tartessos differently. They began to look at it the way a man looks at a house he wishes he owned. The colony at Gadir grew. It stopped being a trading post and started being a power. By the 6th century BC, Carthage, the Phoenician colony in North Africa that had grown into an empire of its own, had established enough influence along the Atlantic coast that the old Tartessian monopoly on Western trade was no longer quite so exclusive. Tartessos still had the silver, but the people who used to need Tartessos to access the Atlantic were starting to wonder if they needed Tartessos at all. The question was still unanswered when the second thread began to pull. There was a king of Tartessos, and his name was Arganthonios. The Greeks loved him. Herodotus wrote about him as if he were a fairy tale, a ruler of almost supernatural generosity and longevity, who greeted Greek traders with open arms and reportedly lived to be 120 years old. His name, in the Tartessian language, means something close to the silver man, a man made of the metal his kingdom produced. He was real. We know this from multiple independent Greek sources. He ruled sometime between roughly 630 and 550 BC, during which time he actively courted Greek friendship, specifically the Phocaeans, sailors from the eastern Aegean, who became frequent visitors to Tartessian ports. When Phocaea was threatened by Persia, Arganthonios reportedly offered them land to settle in his kingdom. He sent them silver to build defensive walls back home. Here was a king who understood that his kingdom's survival depended on relationships, on alliances, on being indispensable to the wider Mediterranean world. And then Arganthonios died. We don't know exactly when. We don't know who succeeded him. What we do know is that after his death, the Phocaean relationship, that crucial bridge to the Greek world, went quiet. The Greek accounts of Tartessos, so detailed and affectionate during Arganthonios' reign, become sparse. Then they become absent. Something changed when the silver man was gone. Something in the political center of Tartessos began, quietly, to fracture. But the fracture inside the palace was nothing compared to what was already happening to the land. The landscape of southwestern Iberia is beautiful, and it is brutal. The same mountains that gave Tartessos its silver are also some of the most mineral-toxic terrain on Earth. The Rio Tinto, the Red River, runs literally red from iron oxide and acid drainage that has leached out of copper mines worked for thousands of years. Modern scientists who have studied the ancient mining sites around the Huelva region have found evidence of extraction so intensive, so relentless, that it would have been poisoning the local water supply for centuries before the civilization collapsed. And then came the drought. Paleoclimatic studies of the Iberian Peninsula show a significant dry period, beginning in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, precisely the period when Tartessos was entering its final phase. The floodplains that made Tartessian agriculture so productive began to dry. The wetlands that defined the geography of the lower Guadalquivir, the very landscape that made this place uniquely defensible and uniquely productive, began to change. The food surplus that had allowed Tartessos to support a complex society, craftsmen, merchants, administrators, priests, began to shrink. The rivers that had always carried silver and grain downriver to waiting ships were carrying less and less of both. Hanno, standing at the docks in the early 6th century BC, would have noticed it. The water was lower than his father remembered. The harvest reports from the upriver farms were concerning. The miners were going deeper for ore that was harder to refine. 3 threats, 3 separate slow-motion catastrophes, all of them accelerating at once. None of them, alone, would have been fatal. But they weren't alone. It happens the way all great collapses happen. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a cascade of threshold events, each one making the next one worse, until one morning, the world that existed yesterday simply doesn't exist anymore. By 530 BC, Carthage has moved decisively. The Carthaginian general Mago, and later his sons, who would become the architects of the most powerful Carthaginian empire the Western Mediterranean had ever seen, began systematically closing the Strait of Gibraltar to non-Carthaginian traders. The Phocian Greeks, who had been Tartessos's most important partners, were driven from their Atlantic routes after a brutal naval engagement near Corsica. The doors through which Tartessos had traded with the wider world were being locked, one by one. The Tartessian silver, still there, still being mined, had no market. Inside the kingdom, the political coherence that Arganthonios had maintained through sheer force of personality and longevity had not survived him. The elite families who controlled the different mining regions and river territories were pulling in different directions. There is no single Greek or Iberian source that describes a civil war in Tartessos, but the archaeological record tells its own story. The great ceremonial centers stopped receiving offerings. The elaborate burial practices, the rich grave goods, the imported luxuries, the carefully constructed funeral chambers become simpler, cheaper, and then absent. Whoever was in charge was either unable or unwilling to maintain the social contracts that had held this civilization together, and the land itself was no longer cooperating. The drought that had been squeezing the agricultural margins for decades had now combined with the silting of the lower river delta. The harbors that had made Tartessos the greatest port in the Western world were becoming shallower. The wetlands that had defined the geography of this place, that had made it navigable, defensible, and productive, were shifting. The world Hanno had been born into was quite literally changing shape beneath his feet. And then it stops. The last Tartessian inscription we have been able to date was carved sometime in the early 5th century BC. After that, nothing. No more inscriptions, no more elaborate burials, no more Tartessian-made objects in the archaeological record. It's not that the people died, it's that the civilization, the shared identity, the language, the culture, the sense of being Tartessian, dissolved. The people became something else, absorbed into the broader Iberian cultural world that was itself being reshaped by Carthaginian and later Celtic pressures from the north and west. Where is Hanno in this moment? Maybe he is old now. Maybe he is standing at the same dock where he stood as a young man, watching a harbor that used to be full and is now almost empty. The Phoenician merchants who were supposed to arrive last month haven't come. The Greek ships haven't come either. Not since Carthage started patrolling the strait. He looks at the river. It is lower than he has ever seen it. He looks at the mountains. They are still there. The silver is still in them. He looks at the city around him. still beautiful, still standing, the gold still on the altars, the carved stone still sharp and clean. And he cannot understand what he is watching. He has no word for it. He has no framework for the idea that a civilization as powerful as his own, as permanent as stone, can simply stop. But here's what almost no one talks about. Tartessos didn't disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because it was strong. In exactly the wrong way. Think about that Carambolo hoard. The extraordinary gold treasure discovered near Seville in 1958. 21 pieces of pure gold, intricately worked, representing the absolute peak of Tartessian artistic achievement. It was found buried, hidden deliberately. The person who buried it never came back to retrieve it. That is not the act of a civilization that collapsed slowly, peacefully, and had time to say goodbye. That is the act of someone who hid their most precious things because something was coming, and then couldn't return. Remember the burial practices? In part 2, we described the elaborate graves, the rich offerings, the imported luxury goods, the carefully constructed chambers that showed how deeply Tartessian culture believed in its own permanence. Here is the callback you might not have seen coming. The archaeologists who have mapped the transition from Tartessian to post-Tartessian burial sites found that the elaborate graves don't just become simpler. In some sites, they stop mid-construction. Tombs that were clearly begun for important people were never finished. Whoever was supposed to complete the burial rites either couldn't or was gone. Not a slow fade, a sudden stop. The Greek accounts of Tartessos were always filtered through Greek interests and Greek imagination. They described Arganthonios as living 120 years because that was their way of saying he was legendary. They described the rivers running with silver because that was their way of processing a trade relationship that made them wealthy. They wrote about Tartessos as if it were a fairy kingdom at the edge of the world because, from the Greek perspective, it was. But those same Greeks, the Phocians who had been to Tartessos, who had traded there, who had been offered land there by a generous king, those Greeks were also the ones who, after the Carthaginian blockade, suddenly had no more stories to tell about Tartessos, because they couldn't go there anymore. The stories stopped not because Tartessos stopped existing, but because the people who told the stories were cut off from it. Imagine if they had seen then what we can see now, that the Carthaginian closure of the strait wasn't just a trade disruption. It was an information blockade. It meant that whatever happened to Tartessos in its final decades happened in complete silence, beyond the edge of the recorded world, with no one watching and no one left to tell the story. The most powerful civilization in the ancient Western world didn't fall in battle. It wasn't burned. It wasn't conquered. It was simply made invisible. And then, without trade, without political unity, without enough water to feed its people, without the partnerships that had given it silver purpose, it dissolved from within, as quietly as salt in rain. A gate left open is dramatic. A gate slowly rusting shut, so gradually no one notices until the day they go to open it and find it won't move. That's Tartessos. The land where Tartessos almost certainly stood, the lower Guadalquivir Delta, the marshlands of what is now the Doñana Natural Park, has been so thoroughly transformed by time, by flooding, by silting, by 2,000 years of human activity and ecological change that even if we knew exactly where to dig, we couldn't. The greatest wetland reserve in Europe sits, possibly, directly on top of the lost capital of the first Western civilization. We live, quite literally, on the ruins of what they built. The silver mines of the Rio Tinto region, worked first by Tartessians, then by Carthaginians, then by Romans, then by medieval miners, then by a British company in the 19th century, are still there. The acid red water still flows. The mining continues in diminished form to this day. Hanno's mountains are still being emptied, 3,000 years after he watched the first ingots come downriver. The Tartessian script, those angular letters carved into standing stones across southern Portugal and southwestern Spain, has been partially decoded. We know how the letters sound. We cannot fully understand what the words mean. Somewhere in those inscriptions are the names, the prayers, the grievances, the love poems and trade records and royal proclamations of a civilization that chose to write things down, believing that writing made things permanent. They were right that writing outlasts flesh. They had no way of knowing it doesn't always outlast comprehension. Tartessos reminds us that civilizations don't need to be conquered to be lost. They need only to be isolated, stressed, and deprived of the connections that gave them meaning. That has never stopped being true. The one question that remains unanswered, the one that has kept archaeologists and historians and satellite imaging teams searching for decades, is not what happened to Tartessos. We know what happened. The question is simpler and more haunting than that. Where exactly is it buried? And what would we find if we could finally open it?